She went from a student at Oklahoma State University to the wife of the son of Armand Hammer. For 25 years, Dru Hammer's life was a fairy tale until the day it all came crashing down.
Author and businesswoman Dru Hammer married into the Armand Hammer dynasty, one of the most powerful and richest families in the world. For years, her life seemed like a fairy tale, until it began to fall apart. With an unexpected divorce and financial betrayal, she hit rock bottom. Dru shares how her faith sustained her through the heartache and allowed her to become stronger and happier in her memoir, Hammered.
Please welcome to the 700 Club, Dru Hammer. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Talk a little bit about what your life was like before you married into the Hammer family.
Well, I was raised in an amazing Pentecostal family, and at 5 years old, my father led me to Christ. And it was one of those things that I could never rebel because it worked. You know, they were never religious.
Yes.
They just were madly in love with Jesus, and they had prayer meetings in their homes. And my dad was always a spiritual leader and prayed for friends. And then my dad prayed for a friend in the hospital, and he was radically healed.
Wow.
And he was a pilot for an airlines and couldn't fly anymore if he had the surgery. And once he was healed, he went on and flew another 40 years.
Oh, my word.
And the Holy Spirit just enveloped my father that night in the car and said, I'm calling you into a healing ministry. So when you've seen that your whole life, how do you ever rebel when you see the miraculous?
Well, it defines your own faith when you're raised up like that.
100%.
So now you grow up and you marry into the Hammer family. And talk about what that transition was like for you.
Oh, heavens. Well, I was flying on an airplane, and he walked on the plane, and the Lord spoke to me and said, that's the man you're going to marry. And I had no idea who he was or where he was from. And we were engaged in 3 weeks and married in 4 months. Wow. And I was whisked to Los Angeles, to a very big world that I was not familiar with. I went from two-stepping at Oklahoma State University to a very adult world that I was not familiar with.
But in that world, you had the opportunity to exercise gifts that God had naturally given you. You loved architecture. You were wonderful at home design. Talk about that part of your life.
Well, I didn't know I was good at it. I think I learned by making a lot of mistakes, because we bought our first home, and I kind of lipsticked it and, you know, redid the surfaces and made money. And I thought, well, that's easy. But what I didn't know is God was preparing me for 25 years later, that he gave me a career and he gave me a business. So God, it was really God who took care of me. And I thought it was just this creative outlet. And God really used it as my provision to take care of me.
So you just mentioned all those years that went by, and 25 years in, you find out that your marriage is not what you thought it was. Devastating time in your life. Share that.
Well, and when you're raised in a faith-filled home like I was, you're always raised that, you know, my parents prayed for the right spouse. And I had a lot of people say to me, well, do you think you made a mistake? And I said, I didn't make a mistake. I had a wonderful 25-year marriage. I have 2 incredible sons. And, you know, we had a great time. But it's not God who fails you. People can fail you. And God was faithful through the whole thing. And now I look back, because you don't grow in good times. You grow in tough times.
Yes.
And when I went through the divorce, I thought I had everything in the world and my life was as perfect as it could be. And then it came crashing down. And I worked at the LA Dream Center for 10 years with women out of, you know, addiction and human trafficking. And when I was going through my divorce, God said, keep showing up. And when I did, those women actually helped me heal. Because I would drive home to my beautiful home in Beverly Hills, and they're sleeping in bunk beds and being restored from coming off the streets. And I thought, how in the world am I going to throw a pity party? And I would show up to minister to them, and they would say, we've been praying for you. How was it in your court date? And I was like, are you kidding me? So it's amazing. I really believe when you're going through tough times, the most important thing is You go out and minister, and that's when God heals you. It's like Job. As soon as he started praying for his enemies, then God started opening the floodgates.
That was a very difficult time for you, not just because you didn't know that the marriage was falling apart, but things became bitter in all of that. I mean, wherever there is prestige and family, money, and all of that, talk about the things that you went through during that time, Dru.
Well, I always say it's kind of the same spirit. And that's why every woman that I talk to, no matter what economic situation you're in, it's the same spirit, because God hates divorce. Yes. It leads to sin, and I can see that. I've been through it. And, you know, they play dirty, because it gets down to, you're the only person in the world keeping me from keeping all my toys, basically. Yes. So it really becomes bitter, but that's when forgiveness comes in. Because I meet women all the time, and I believe God's given me a platform to really work with women, because I see so many of them coming out of divorce, and even 10 years later, they're filled with bitterness. Yes. And it's not hurting the other person. They've moved on. It's hurting them. So that's the platform that God's really given me to help women. And when it's too big for you, that's when the Holy Spirit comes in.
It's supposed to be too big for us.
Yes, and because that's when we rely on God. So now, you know, when Michael died, he passed away last year, I would go to his hospital room, or I would go to his home, and I would crawl in bed with him or wrap my arms around him and tell him how much I loved him and exonerate him for the incredible father he was. And he was broken because he was abused as a child. So, you know, the saying, hurt people, hurt people.
Yes.
And I think that was his way of acquiring self-esteem when he was so abused as a child.
It creates a need in us that's hard to understand.
Yes.
But only with the Lord, as God gave you the grace to forgive, were you able to make that understanding of his past cover some of the hurt.
Well, and I also wish that I knew then what I know now.
Yes.
Because, you know, back then, I think problems were swept under the carpet. And, you know, you just go on and you think everything's perfect, and on the surface it certainly seemed like it. But there were deep-stemmed issues. And I wish that I would have known more then. We probably should have been in years of, you know, Christian counseling, of really digging those things out so you would deal with it and let God restore you.
God always restores. He always takes the mess and gives us a message.
Yes, he does.
You have a nonprofit called Hammered Hearts. Talk to us about that.
Well, I actually brought the stone. I don't know if you can see it, but I was in Caesarea. My friend Kathy Lee Gifford took me.
Is this the stone?
That is the first cast of the stone.
Wow.
I still have the original stone in my safe. But I'm standing in Caesarea, and I was very broken because I had just finalized my divorce, and my world was just upside down. And I was in Israel, and I'm standing in Caesarea where Paul stood trial before King Herod for preaching the gospel. And I was in Israel like a Stepford wife. I was walking around with no emotion because I'd realized I had just shut off my emotion as, you know, self-preservation. So as I was standing there, I see this very stone, and I go, oh my gosh. And it wasn't a perfect commercial heart. It looked like a jeweler had hammered it. Yeah. And that's where I got the name Hammered for my book, because every heart has been hammered. But when I picked it up and I had it in my hand, the Holy Spirit completely enveloped me. And he said, Dru, I'm going to take your heart of stone, and I'm going to turn it to flesh, and I'm going to heal your heart. Wow. And the floodgates opened. I began weeping at that moment, and then I was a chocolate mess the rest of the time. I was all over Israel sobbing, and, you know, just a disaster, but good tears.
Yes, when God breaks through those defenses that we put up, it's such a deep cleansing. That's what Dru's book is all about. It's called Hammered. It's available nationwide, and if you're someone who has struggled with being broken or learning to forgive, or you feel like life just can never be fresh and new again, you need to read the book. It's an amazing story. Thank you, Dru.
Thank you for
so
having
much.
me. And you can
Wonderful
get
to
it
have
on
you.
druville.com. It's kind of funny, because I've renovated over 40 properties. My sons tell everyone they grew up in Whoville because I decorate with hot pinks and lime greens. So I started a brand as well that will feed into my foundation as well as the book sales. So you can get it on
Hammered.
druville.com.
Great.
Or Amazon.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for having me.